The morning sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood by the tall windows of his private study. His hands trembled slightly as he held the official letter that had arrived just hours earlier. Kate entered the room quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the polished wooden floor. She could see the tension in her husband's shoulders, the way he held his breath as if preparing for something difficult. "What is it?" she asked softly, moving closer to him. William turned to face her, his blue eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and uncertainty. The letter bore the royal seal, and Kate immediately understood this was no ordinary correspondence. They had been expecting news about a particular matter for weeks, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to read together. William cleared his throat and began reading aloud. The formal language of the document seemed to fill the room with a heavy atmosphere. It was about a decision that would affect not just them, but their entire family. As he continued reading, Kate felt her own eyes beginning to well up with tears. This was something they had hoped for, worked toward. But the reality of it happening was overwhelming. The couple had been through many challenges together over the years. From the early days of their courtship at university to their fairy tale wedding, from becoming parents to taking on increasing royal duties, they had always supported each other. But this moment felt different. This felt like a turning point that would change everything they thought they knew about their future. Kate reached for William's free hand, intertwining their fingers as she always did when they needed to face something together. They stood there in silence for several minutes, both trying to process what they had just learned. The weight of responsibility that came with their royal positions had always been significant, but this news would require them to make decisions that went beyond their roles as Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. Outside, the grounds of Kensington Palace continued their daily rhythm. Gardeners tended to the flower beds. Security personnel maintained their quiet vigilance. Staff members went about their duties. None of them knew that inside the palace walls, two of the most photographed people in the world were struggling with emotions they rarely allowed themselves to feel so deeply. William folded the letter carefully and placed it on his desk. He looked at Kate, seeing his own feelings reflected in her expression. They both knew that whatever decision they made next would ripple through their lives and the lives of their children. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were still young. But they would be affected by this news in ways that William and Kate were only beginning to understand. The irony was not lost on them that despite living in one of the most magnificent palaces in the world, surrounded by luxury and privilege, they were facing the same kind of difficult emotional moment that any couple might face. The letter had brought news that was both wonderful and terrifying, hopeful and uncertain. As the morning progressed, Kate found herself walking through the rooms of their home, touching familiar objects and thinking about how this news might change everything. William spent time on phone calls with his private secretary and other advisors, but even their expertise couldn't fully prepare him for the personal impact of what lay ahead. By afternoon, they'd made the decision to keep the news private for why. A few more days while they processed their feelings and planned their next steps. They agreed that they needed time to be just William and Kate, not the Duke and Duchess, not future monarchs. Just a husband and wife dealing with something that would change their world forever. 3 days had passed since the letter arrived, and Kate found herself unable to concentrate on her usual activities. She had attended a charity event the previous afternoon, smiling for cameras and making polite conversation, but her mind kept drifting back to the secret they were carrying. William had been equally distracted during his meetings with various organizations and officials. The children noticed something was different. Prince George, being the oldest, was particularly observant. During breakfast that morning, he had asked his mother why she seemed sad. Kate had managed to deflect his questions with talk about his upcoming school activities, but she could see the concern in her son's young eyes. Charlotte and Louis continued their usual playful behavior, unaware that their parents were grappling with news that would eventually affect their entire family. Kate decided to visit her parents in Bucklebury. The drive through the English countryside usually brought her peace. But today, even the familiar rolling hills and quaint villages couldn't lift her spirits. Her mother, Carol Middleton, immediately sensed something was wrong when Kate arrived at the family home. They sat in the garden where Kate had played as a child, surrounded by the roses her mother loved to tend. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Carol said gently, pouring tea from the floral china set that had been in the family for years. Kate appreciated her mother's directness. In the royal world, conversations were often formal and careful, but here she could speak more freely about her feelings. Kate explained as much as she could, without revealing the specific details that needed to remain confidential for now. Her mother listened with the patience and wisdom that only comes from years of watching her daughter navigate the complexities of royal life. Carol had seen Kate through many difficult moments, from the early media attention during her relationship with William to the intense scrutiny that came with their engagement and marriage. Meanwhile, William was having his own difficult conversation with his father. King Charles had always been understanding about the unique pressures his son faced. Having experienced them himself throughout his life, they met in the king's private study at Clarence House, a room filled with books, artwork, and personal mementos that reflected Charles's many interests and passions. The conversation between father and son was both practical and emotional. Charles offered advice based on his own experiences, but he also acknowledged that each generation faced different challenges and expectations. William appreciated his father's support, but he knew that ultimately he and Kate would have to make their own decisions about how to handle what was coming that evening. William and Kate took a long walk around the grounds of Kensington Palace. The setting sun cast a golden light through the trees, and for a moment, they could almost forget about the pressures and responsibilities that defined their daily lives. They talked about their early days together, remembering when their biggest concerns were university exams and whether they would have enough money for dinner at their favorite restaurant. They also spoke about their children and what kind of life they wanted to provide for them. Both William and Kate had strong feelings about giving George, Charlotte, and Louis as normal a childhood as possible, despite their royal status. The news they had received would make that goal even more challenging, but they were determined to find a way to protect their children's innocence for as long as possible. As they returned to the palace, Kate noticed a small door in the garden wall that she had never paid much attention to before. It was old and weathered, painted green, to blend in with the surrounding vegetation. William followed her gaze and smiled for the first time in days. "I used to play around that door when I was young," he said. "I always wondered where it led, but I was never brave enough to find out." The next morning brought more official correspondence and phone calls that William had to handle in his capacity as heir to the throne. Kate watched him from across their breakfast table, noting how he straightened his shoulders and adopted the formal tone that royal duty required. She had learned over the years to recognize the subtle ways he shifted between being her husband and being a future king. Their press secretary had been asking questions about upcoming engagements and whether there were any changes to their schedule that needed to be communicated to the media. Both William and Kate knew they would have to make an announcement soon, but they were still struggling with how to frame the news in a way that would be honest, yet protect their family's privacy. Kate spent the morning with Charlotte and Louis in the palace nursery. The room was filled with toys, books, and artwork that the children had created during their playtime. As she watched them build elaborate towers with colorful blocks and create imaginary worlds with their dolls in action, she felt a deep ache in her chest. These innocent moments would become even more precious once their lives changed again. Charlotte, with her characteristic determination, had built a castle that was taller than she was. "Look, Mama," she called out proudly, "strong enough for a princess to live in safely." Kate smiled at her daughter's confidence, remembering her own childhood dreams about fairy tales and happy endings. The reality of royal life was far more complex than any storybook, but she hoped her children would always maintain some of that magical thinking. William joined them for lunch, something he tried to do as often as his schedule allowed. The family ate in their private dining room, away from the formal staterooms where official meals were served. George entertained them with stories from his classes, while Charlotte and Louis competed for attention with their own animated tales about playground adventures and new discoveries. After lunch, William suggested they all go for a walk in the gardens. It was a beautiful spring day, with flowers blooming throughout the carefully maintained grounds. The children ran ahead, chasing butterflies and examining interesting stones and leaves they found along the pathways. Kate and William followed at a slower pace, both treasuring these moments of relative normalcy. They found themselves approaching the small green door that Kate had noticed the evening before. George had discovered it too and was trying to peek through the keyhole, his curiosity evident in every line of his small body. "Can we open it, Papa?" he asked, looking up at William with hopeful eyes. William looked at Kate, and she could see him making a decision that went beyond simply satisfying their son's curiosity. "I don't know if we have the key," he said thoughtfully, "but maybe we can find out what's behind it." There was something in his voice that suggested he was talking about more than just the door. They spent several minutes examining the old wooden door more carefully. The paint was faded and chipped in places, and the metal hinges showed signs of age and weather. Charlotte pointed out that there were tiny flowers growing around the base of the door, as if nature was trying to reclaim this forgotten entrance. Kate noticed that William seemed more relaxed than he had been in days. There was something about this simple family moment, this shared curiosity about a mysterious door, that reminded them both of what was truly important. Whatever challenges they were facing, whatever difficult decisions lay ahead, they were facing them together as a family. Louis, not to be left out of the investigation, had found a small stick and was using it to trace the outline of the door. His serious concentration made both William and Kate laugh, breaking some of the tension they had been carrying. For the first time since receiving that official letter, they felt like they might be able to handle whatever was coming next. That evening, after the children had been put to bed with their usual bedtime stories and gentle songs, William made a phone call to the head groundskeeper at Kensington Palace. Thomas had worked on the palace grounds for over 30 years and knew every corner, every tree, and every structure better than anyone else. The old garden door? Thomas chuckled when William asked about it. "Haven't heard anyone mention that in years. Used to lead to a private garden that was created for Queen Mary back in the early 1900s. It's been locked up for decades. But I believe I still have the key somewhere in my workshop." William felt a surge of excitement that surprised him. Here, he was dealing with some of the most serious responsibilities a person could face. And yet the prospect of opening a forgotten door filled him with the kind of anticipation he hadn't felt since childhood. Kate noticed the change in his demeanor immediately when he shared Thomas's information with her. The next morning brought another round of official duties for both of them. Kate had a video conference with several charities she supported, discussing upcoming projects and fundraising initiatives. William attended meetings about security arrangements for future royal events. But throughout their separate responsibilities, both found their thoughts drifting to the mysterious garden that might be waiting behind the old green door. During a brief break in their schedules, they decided to call Thomas and arrange to meet him at the door that afternoon. They didn't tell the children about their plan, wanting to explore first and see what they might find. There was indeed a hidden garden waiting to be discovered. They could decide together whether it would be safe and appropriate for George, Charlotte, and Louis to visit. Thomas arrived at the appointed time carrying an old brass key that looked as weathered as the door itself. He was a tall, gentle man with kind eyes and hands that showed the evidence of years spent working with soil and plants. "I haven't been back here myself in quite some time," he admitted as he approached the door. The garden was closed off when the family moved into different quarters, and we focused our attention on the main grounds. As Thomas inserted the key into the lock, William reached for Kate's hand. They stood together, watching as he turned the key with some difficulty. Mechanism was stiff from years of disuse, but finally they heard the satisfying click of the lock opening. Thomas stepped back and gestured for William to do the honors of actually opening the door. William pushed gently. The door swung open with a long creak that spoke of its age and neglect. What they saw beyond the threshold took their breath away. The hidden garden was overgrown and wild, but still recognizably beautiful. Roses had climbed and spread beyond their original boundaries, creating natural arches and tunnels of flowers. Stone pathways wound between areas that had once been formal flower beds, but were now charming in their untamed state. Kate stepped through the doorway first, her eyes wide with wonder. The garden was larger than she had expected, enclosed by high brick walls that were covered with ivy and climbing plants. In the center stood a small pavilion, its white-painted structure weathered but still elegant. Around it, fruit trees that had been left to grow naturally provided shade and shelter. William followed her, with Thomas bringing up the rear. The groundskeeper pointed out various features as they explored, explaining what the garden had been. Like in its heyday, Queen Mary used to come here for her morning tea, he said, indicating the pavilion. She said it was the one place in the palace where she could feel completely private and peaceful. As they wandered through the overgrown paths, Kate began to envision what this space could become. It wouldn't take much work to clear the pathways and trim back the most aggressive growth, while still maintaining the garden's enchanting, slightly wild character. This could be a place where their children could play and explore safely, away from the public areas of the palace grounds. The discovery of the secret garden seemed to shift something fundamental in both William and Kate's perspective. As they spent more time exploring the hidden space over the following days, they began to see it as a metaphor for their own situation. Sometimes the most beautiful and meaningful things in life were found behind doors that seemed ordinary or forgotten. Kate started bringing a notebook with her during their visits to the garden, sketching ideas for how different areas could be restored while maintaining their natural charm. She envisioned areas where the children could have tea parties under the fruit trees, places where they could plant their own small gardens and learn about growing things, and quiet corners where the family could retreat when they needed time. Away from their public responsibilities, William found himself drawn to the old pavilion. With Thomas's help, they discovered that the structure was actually in much better condition than it had initially appeared. The roof was solid, and the floorboards, while weathered, were still sound. It would need painting and some minor repairs, but it could easily become a beautiful retreat where the family could spend private time together. The children were becoming increasingly curious about where their parents disappeared to each afternoon. George, in particular, had noticed that both William and Kate seemed happier and more relaxed than they had been in recent weeks. Charlotte had observed that her mother was drawing more frequently, filling pages with flowers and garden designs that were different from her usual sketches. Finally, William and Kate decided it was time to share their discovery with the children. They planned it as a special adventure, telling George, Charlotte, and Louis that they had found something magical that they wanted to share with them. The excitement in the children's eyes reminded both parents of the joy that could be found in simple surprises and new experiences. Leading their children to the green door felt like a ceremonial moment. William lifted Louis so he could better see as Kate turned the now familiar key in the lock. George and Charlotte pressed close, practically vibrating with anticipation. When the door swung open to reveal the secret garden, their reactions were everything William and Kate had hoped for. Charlotte gasped and clapped her hands together, immediately running toward the rose arches that created natural doorways throughout the space. George stood still for a moment, taking in the entirety of what he was seeing before breaking into a huge grin and following his sister into the garden. Louis pointed at everything with excitement, his vocabulary not yet adequate to express his amazement. The family spent the entire afternoon exploring every corner of the garden together. They discovered a small pond that was hidden behind overgrown bushes, complete with lily pads and a family of frogs that delighted the children. They found apple and pear trees that were heavy with developing fruit, promising delicious treats later in the season. In the pavilion, Kate spread out a blanket she had brought, and they had an impromptu picnic with sandwiches and fruit that they had hastily assembled before their garden adventure. As they sat together in their newly discovered sanctuary, William realized that his perspective on their recent challenging news had completely transformed. The secret garden had reminded him that even in the most structured and public life, there could be spaces for private joy, family intimacy, and simple pleasures. Whatever changes were coming for their family, whatever new responsibilities and challenges they would face, they had each other, and they had this beautiful, hidden place where they could always retreat to remember what truly mattered. Kate watched her husband's face as he observed their children playing freely in the garden, and she could see that he had found a kind of peace he had been missing. The weight of the official letter and its implications hadn't disappeared, but it no longer seemed quite so overwhelming. 2 weeks after discovering the secret garden, William and Kate were ready to face the news that had initially seemed so overwhelming. The hidden garden had become their daily refuge, a place where they could discuss their feelings openly and plan for their future without the formal constraints of royal protocol. They had decided to restore the garden gradually, involving the children in the process so it would become a true family project. Thomas had enthusiastically agreed to oversee the work, and he brought decades of experience and a genuine love for the palace grounds to the endeavor. Kate's sketches had evolved into detailed plans that balanced historical authenticity with practical family needs. The official announcement they had been avoiding finally came on a sunny Tuesday morning. William and Kate stood together in their private study, no longer fighting back tears but instead holding each other with quiet strength. The news that had once seemed like an impossible burden now felt manageable because they had rediscovered what grounded them as a family. The letter had informed them that due to changing circumstances in the royal family, William would need to take on significantly more responsibilities as heir to the throne, effectively preparing more actively for his future role as king. This meant increased public duties, more formal state functions, and less privacy for their family. For any couple, this would have been daunting news, but the secret garden had taught them something important about finding sanctuary within structure, about creating private joy within public service. They realized they could face these new challenges because they had each other, and because they had learned to value and protect the simple moments that made their family strong. Kate called her parents to share the news, and for the first time, since receiving that first letter, she felt excited rather than anxious about the future. She described the garden to her mother, explaining how discovering it had helped them see their situation from a completely different perspective. Carol Middleton understood immediately, remembering how her own family had always found strength in small traditions and private spaces. William spoke with his father again, this time with confidence rather than uncertainty. He explained how the hidden garden had reminded him that even kings and queens needed places where they could simply be human. King Charles, who had always found solace in his own gardens, understood the profound impact that this discovery had made on his son and daughter. Law. The children adapted to their parents' new sense of purpose with the resilience that young people often show. George began asking more questions about what it meant to be part of the royal family, and William found himself able to answer with honesty about both the privileges and responsibilities involved. Charlotte and Louis continued to find endless entertainment in their secret garden, treating it as the most magical playground imaginable. As summer progressed, the garden restoration became a source of joy rather than work for the entire family. They planted new flowers together, cleared pathways side by side, and slowly brought the pavilion back to its former beauty. Kate documented their progress with photographs, creating a visual diary of how something neglected and forgotten could bloom again with love and attention. The secret garden became a metaphor for their approach to their changing royal duties. They would find ways to create private spaces within their public lives, to maintain their family bonds while serving their country, and to help their children understand that duty and joy were not mutually exclusive. Years later, when historians would write about this period in William and Kate's lives, they might focus on the official duties and public appearances. But within the family, they would always remember this as the time when a hidden door opened to reveal not just a forgotten garden, but a new way of understanding how to balance love, duty, and the pursuit of happiness within the extraordinary circumstances of their royal lives.